Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this video. So many of you have probably already seen the video of Sam Shamoon debating Dr. Nasser on the Islamic dilemma. It's gone over 1 million views, so it's kind of taken off, it's gone quite viral. And there are now other Muslims who are addressing this content as kind of a reaction to try and improve on Dr. Nasser and what Dr. Nasser failed to do, which was defeat the Islamic dilemma. And one of those people is one of our favorite people, the heavyweight, in more ways than one, defender of Islam, the man who is known for his responses to the Islamic dilemma. That is Libiano, the Orthodox Muslim, innovator of the Islamic dilemma responses. It is this Orthodox guy. He's probably one of the sort of younger up-and-coming Muslim da'is who isn't afraid to basically be known as a defender of some of the most foul things in the world. Now, many of you may know I've tried to have conversations with Libiano in the past, and he's made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to have conversations with me, in particular about this very topic, the Islamic dilemma. Probably because I happen to be someone who knows a little thing about the Islamic dilemma, having just written a book on the topic. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I've actually written a book, in case none of you knew this, because you've been living under a rock for the last so many months. You can buy the Islamic Dilemma book with a foreword by Dr. David Wood, the most comprehensive work you can find on this particular argument and its historic roots, what the argument is, some advice on how to employ it, some things you should definitely do and some things you should definitely not do when presenting the argument, and also how to refute people like Libiano, who still hasn't responded to this, by the way. For a guy who says he's exhaustively responded to it, he has suspiciously not responded to it. But oh well. Anyway, in a form of damage control, after Sam completely annihilated Dr. Nasser on the Islamic dilemma, and now 1 million more people have potentially been introduced to the Islamic dilemma, so thank you, Dr. Nasser. We have this damage control moment from Libiano, and now he's joined with Cora the Explorer, the man of mystery himself, for them to discuss this argument. And it's just peak for me. It's peak content. You can tell just by watching this, they are incredibly uncomfortable by what they're talking about. And Libiano doesn't really want to do anything with this, but he just feels like he has to respond, and so he's very low energy. He doesn't really want to go into this very much, and nothing is like, he doesn't enjoy any of this. Nothing about what he's doing in this video he enjoys. He feels like he has to do this, which is brilliant, because it means that I get to respond to it. So let's see what Libiano's greatest responses are to the Islamic dilemma. But let's see how he starts things first, and we can take it from there.
I'm doing good. Ready to get into it. The Islamic dilemma.
Indeed.
We've covered this intensively on my channel, and just looking to cover it even a bit more. It's something that the Christians have unfortunately made a serious argument. It's really not a serious argument, and the only reason we cover it is because they've made it such a serious argument that we're just kind of forced to engage with it. But it's really, hold on, what the heck happened?
So at this point, the demons in Libiano's room start interfering with his light, turning it on and off. But ignoring the demon manifesting in Libiano's room, Libiano kind of just sets the stage as, well, this is not a serious argument. Which is weird, because historically both Muslims and Christians took it as a serious problem, as a serious thing that needed a solution, so much so that Muslims don't even have a unified consensus, an ijma, on this particular issue, as he is fully aware, being one of the innovators who came up with a new way of trying to solve it, which is great. Thank you, Orthodox Muslim. So right from the get-go, he's just trying to spin a narrative, right? This is not true at all. Christians don't say it's true. Muslims don't say it's true. You can look at it historically. Bulus ibn Raja, George of Baltan, as well as early Muslim scholars acknowledged this as a pain point in their theology. But, he's got to say something, right? He's got to give some kind of meat out to his fan base. And this is what he's giving them. Now watch this clip, because this is just weird for me, right? Later on in this discussion, Cora asks him what this argument is, what is the Islamic dilemma, and he gives like a very basic, bare bones rendition of it. And he goes on to say that this argument has been around for a long time.
Well, it's been around for a long time.
Which you would have thought, if an argument isn't serious, why has it been going on for so long? But apparently that's not a thought he has. And he then goes on to say this about why it all of a sudden got popular.
Why it became popular? Simply because they had a campaign last year to push it heavy. So they were all pushing it heavy, and they all decided to make videos about it and go from panel to panel, from Muslim Da'i to another. And with the videos coming out, it just became popular simply because some people were not able to deal with the Islamic dilemma properly because they misunderstand the hidden pre-assumptions that come with it. And so it becomes attractive to a Christian audience because of its simplicity. That is that it's...
Yes, Libiano, absolutely. It was a campaign. David Wood was at the forefront of it. We had an entire team of people reading the Quran, including me. I read the whole Quran with a team of Christians over a period of like 2 to 3 months. We developed tools to analyze the Quran, looking for specific terms and phrases in the Arabic. We had Arabic speakers come and guide us on understanding what we were reading. And it ultimately led with me writing a book. That is The Islamic Dilemma. So he is right, there was a big push for this, mostly because we're a unified team of people that like don't try and one-up each other at every moment. And yeah, we're not like the Dawa guys. Let's put it that way. So good shout out there, Libiano. Now take a look at what Libiano says next about other Dawa guys, because this is kind of what I mean. Dawa guys constantly throw each other under the bus because they all have their own views and they don't work together. They argue amongst themselves, trying to establish the dominant view, and so they have to take pot shots at each other. And it's beautiful. Watch this.
It just became popular simply because some people were not able to deal with the Islamic dilemma properly because they misunderstand the hidden pre-assumptions that come with it.
He admits that there are Dawa guys that haven't been able to respond to the Islamic dilemma, which I wonder who those guys are. I'm willing to bet, in Libiano's view, Dr. Nasser failed to respond adequately to the Islamic dilemma when he debated Sam Shamoun. I'm willing to bet that's actually his view. But I'm also willing to bet he's grateful that Dr. Nasser did it and not him, so he doesn't suffer the embarrassment of having to debate the Islamic dilemma in front of a crowd of 1 million people, only to be absolutely demolished. Now, I want you to watch this clip because this is Libiano trying to just flat out lie to people, mostly again for a Muslim audience, to try and downplay what the Islamic dilemma is and try to strawman it and portray it as something it's not. So let's watch what he says here.
In the eyes of the Christian audience. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It's an absurd argument. It has no precedence in academia.
Did you hear that? He just said there's no academic basis or established line of thinking for the Islamic dilemma. No tradition, there are no people with PhDs that mention this, that the Quran confirms the previous scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel, but also contradicts them. The Quran doesn't mention corruption. Ultimately trying to convince you is the case. No one talks about this, apparently, in academia. This is a load of crap. It's completely false. There's absolutely no truth to that whatsoever. It is just people saying this, hoping they can convince you of it because you haven't looked for yourself. He's also taking advantage of the fact that it's called the Islamic dilemma, and no one in academia is going to call it the Islamic dilemma. That term goes back to about the 90s, so you're talking about less than 30 years ago. That's the term that Christian apologists were using to popularize the argument. But the argument, like I said before, traces back to the early first centuries of Islam with George of Beltane, or the Bishop of Antioch, as well as Bulus ibn Raja, a ex-Muslim convert to Christianity. What actually happens in academia is that academics are very interested in the premises of the argument. They love that. In fact, it's incredibly well talked about in academia. The idea the Quran talks about the previous scriptures is well known, well documented. It's written about extensively in many different forms. The fact that the Quran also contradicts with these scriptures is again written about extensively, well known. People know about the differences. We know about the opposing theologies. You can watch basically anyone at any time who's a professor of Islamic studies or even just a student of Islamic studies, and this topic will come up because it's a popular one. And the fact that the Quran does not teach corruption. There is nothing in it that you could use to come to a doctrine of corruption of the prior revelations, at least in a textual basis, meaning universal corruption, right? The Torah has been changed and the original's been lost. The gospel's been changed, it's been lost. What Muhammad at his time was just some corrupt thing, right? You won't get that doctrine from the Quran. And academics know this, and Muslims talk about this. Here are some examples. Dr. Abdullah Galadari, in his book Quranic Hermeneutics, he writes about this, how the Quran has a very positive view of the prior scriptures, particularly the Torah and Gospel, and he also acknowledges that there does appear to be contradictions, and he actually suggests that you can harmonize them. That's his view. So he acknowledges the weight of the dilemma and puts forth his own possible solution. Dr. Martin Whittingham is the chairman for the Oxford Centre for Christian Muslim Studies here in the UK. As part of an institution based in Oxford, they are interested in having interfaith dialogues with Muslims and Christians, and one of the ways they do that, both from Muslims and from Christians, is by acknowledging that the Quran has a positive view of prior scriptures and confirms them and stands in continuity with them according to the Quran. So the very basis of this positive relationship, and then in contrast to the Islamic paradigm of, well, actually, Jesus isn't the Son of God, Jesus isn't God, Allah is not a father, so on and so forth, they're able to have these arguments and be invited to analyze the biblical text for wahi, or revelation, which is supposedly, according to Dean and Libiano's view, still in the Bible that we have today. So that's great. Dr. Martin Cadd is another person who, again, does a very similar thing. He points out all this data. He's written books on this topic. Dr. Martin Whittingham has written books on this topic. Gordon Nickel, he's also written books on this topic, as well as other Muslims, particularly reformers. They noticed this and they also wrote extensively on this. So the idea that it has no academic basis is just false. I actually happen to know a handful of scholars who do know about the Islamic dilemma and do see the problem that it poses to Islamic theology. So to suggest it has no academic basis is it's just false, to be honest with you, and it's just a really dumb thing that relies on the audience being slightly more dumber than he is, which, as Libiano has proved, is possible.
All right, so you mentioned hidden pre-assumptions within the Islamic dilemma. So can you give us an example of a hidden pre-assumption or the hidden pre-assumptions within this argument?
Yeah, so it rests on the pre-assumption that the confirmation is an absolute and total confirmation, which must be substantiated.
So now Libiano is doing the first classic misdirection. Don't look at the dilemma, it's too strong. Don't look at the argument, it's like the sun. If we look at it directly, we're just going to blind ourselves. So let's just reframe it as something weaker and as something less difficult to deal with so that we can deal with the easier thing, right? This is classic strawman. He says that it relies on there being a total affirmation. The idea that the Quran affirms the Torah and the Gospel, it confirms them, it says they're inspired, preserved, and authoritative in totality. Meaning there are no aspects of corruption in these texts. They are, at the time of Muhammad, perfectly sound, fully preserved, fully authoritative, fully inspired. This isn't true. This is not true, not even by a long shot. You can actually go with a general or a broad kind of confirmation, which is what his view is. Now, he doesn't know what the word general means because for some reason he doesn't understand English, like his friend Dean. But what they mean by general is actually the opposite. They mean particular. So they mean a specific kind of confirmation, not a broad general kind of confirmation. But they'll call it general confirmation just to make it confusing. But let's help them out and let's just go with it. Just remember in your head you actually just mean specific. So Libiano is going to say a specific confirmation means that the Quran can affirm some things as being true in the previous scriptures, in the Torah and Gospel, but can also reject certain things in the Torah and Gospel. It's not bound to confirming everything, like a total confirmation. It's just bound to confirm some things. And this is their sort of get out clause about how they handle this and how they deal with all the contradictions in the Quran that contradict with the Torah and Gospel it's supposedly in continuity with. The problem is, as he would have read if he had bothered to read my book, but whether or not he can read is a question that I don't have the answer to yet, so maybe he can't. If he can, someone please help. Maybe I should make an audiobook just for Libiano. But the main point is this. The Quran makes it very clear that even if you were to think it was just talking about aspects of these scriptures, but the Quran confirms these different aspects explicitly. In other words, the Quran talks about soteriology. It talks about what it means to be saved for the Christians and Jews. We can look at Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, Ayah 66 to 69, and we can clearly see that 1, Christians and Jews can be saved prior to Muhammad revealing the Quran, and 2, and that this is common knowledge throughout the Christian and Jewish communities. In other words, there's a normative way they can go to heaven. There's a normal way they can do it, right? If they follow their Torah and Gospel, they can go to heaven. Great. So that means the Quran confirms salvific elements in these texts because they're authoritative to go to heaven. In Surah 69, it even gives the context of specifically what a Christian or Jew can believe to get into heaven, and that is Allah, the last day, doing righteous deeds, so on and so forth. Well, there's a lot of that that's going to cause lots of problems when we actually read the Gospel and Torah and realize they contradict the Quranic understanding of those things, particularly about who Allah is. And of course, we compare that to the verse before. Just read verse 68, right before 69. 68 tells us, you have nothing to stand on unless you stand on the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran. So all these things should be in agreement about what it means to get into heaven. And yet, that's not true, and therefore the Quran is in error. Another category is the prophet stories. Surah 12, Ayah 111 makes it very clear that there is a lesson of understanding regarding the prophets and their accounts for people of wisdom, and that this message, this Quran, is confirming this. That they have, right? It's confirming these prophet stories. Okay, so the prophet stories are another thing that are being confirmed in the Quran. The story of Joseph for the Jews is being confirmed in the Quran. Moses, Abraham, Noah, Jonah, all these things are all being confirmed for us. Brilliant stuff. The prophecies are being confirmed in the Quran. The Quran makes it very clear that there are prophecies in the Torah and Gospel, particularly about Muhammad, that are being confirmed. So prophecies are a valid confirmation that the Quran tells us is being confirmed in the prior scriptures. You have prophecies in there, this Quran is confirming them. So when Jesus prophesied his own death in the Gospel, if you're a Sunni Muslim, you're going to have some real problems with that if the Quran is telling you that the prophecies are valid in the Gospel that supposedly the Quran is confirming. Yet somehow we see that this Gospel is also contradicting the Quran, so no easy way out there. And one last point, he says, look, you know, this is assumption, you guys are just, you're bringing this in an assumption that the Quran means a total confirmation, and you need to establish that. To which I say, okay, that sounds fair. How about the fact that there are 18 verses in the Quran that confirm our Gospel and Torah, that do so in a broad, unspecified sense, that don't mention specifics, they just say, confirm mabaina yadehi, what is between your hands or between its hands, or confirming what is with you or with them. So that would be present sense. That would be the present tense. And now, because it never specifies and never elaborates in any of these 18 places where the Quran says this, which is quite a lot when you really think about it, we can just apply how language works from a common sense point of view to deter what the author is trying to convey here. So for example, if I said on 18 different occasions to different people that I believe in the Quran, and I did not elaborate, I never said anything else, I didn't say I believe in the Quran, but only this bit. I believe in the Quran, but specifically this bit. I believe in the Quran only in parts. I believe in Surah 5, but not Surah 6. If I just tell you none of those things, I just say, I believe in the Quran, and I've done that multiple times, and I've never elaborated. In fact, the purpose of the statement was to convey that I have a message that's given to me, and its purpose is to confirm, at least one of its purposes is to confirm the Quran. The only valid understanding of that linguistically is that I am confirming all of the Quran, not that I'm just confirming a part of it, because in order to derive that, I would have had to explicitly said, and in the absence of it, we need to look at how language is used. And normally when you agree with someone or something, or you say something about something and you never qualify or elaborate, you would mean it in the sense that is normal, the normative form. So you would mean it in how it's normally understood. So it just boils down to this. When people speak in language, if I say I confirm the Quran and I never elaborate, people will think I'm a Muslim, right? If I just keep going around to random people saying I confirm the Quran is from Allah, I confirm the Quran, I confirm the Quran. The only way that Libiano and whoever else makes up this random nonsense can make their point is basically by saying that whenever and this is an equivalent here, this is analogous. Whenever someone comes up to a Muslim and says they believe in the Quran, you can't assume they mean the whole Quran. And if they were consistent in that, that would be bizarre, because that would basically mean whenever one of your Muslim brothers goes to the mosque and he says, you know, I believe in the Quran, you would have to think, I don't actually know if he means the whole Quran or just aspects of it. But that's not how language works, and that's not how the meaning is conveyed. And the only way you would get that is if there was elaboration, and there is no elaboration. So that's why total is the default position, precisely because that's how language works. When people talk about things and they ascribe predicates, properties to things, unless they elaborate, you apply it to the object itself in whole. You don't say, not this, but this, but not this, but this. Unless you can infer from the context or it's qualified in somewhere else. And it's not. So
now, we could demonstrate from the Quran that this is not the case.
But wait, Libiano can demonstrate from the Quran that it's definitely not meaning a total confirmation. It means a specific general confirmation, and he can use his big brain to show us that. So let's watch Libiano do exactly that. Let's see his great argument, I'm sure.
According to the Quran, this is something we call conscious editing.
Conscious editing. Oh, the best argument. The argument that just... Ladies and gentlemen, conscious editing is... It is the best argument. If you thought general confirmation was very, very, very dumb, you're in for the next level stuff. This is ChatGPT garbage, basically, that Dean Response got one night when he was desperately looking for answers for the Islamic dilemma, and this is what they go with now. So much so that I had to write an entire part of my book dealing with this because of how dumb it is, but how popular it is. Like, everyone uses this now who's an innovator and comes up with these new answers. So conscious edits, like general confirmation, is wrong English. Like, they don't know how to name things properly, and it's incredibly misleading, and I would actually say that's intentional. Conscious edits sounds like all it's really getting at is that Allah is choosing to edit something intentionally, with intent, right? That's not what they mean. It's what they kind of want you to think, because that's very easy to establish, right? In the Quran, you know, the author clearly goes on tangents and writes his own stuff and deviates and injects his own commentary to make it sound like it's about Muhammad. Like, this is standard stuff. So yeah, if you just had to say that's easy enough to show. But it's not what they actually mean, and it's not what they want you to believe. What they want you to believe is like a hidden assumption that comes along with it. What they actually want you to believe is that the purpose of the Quran, or at least one of the purposes of the Quran, is to act as a revealing of prior revelation, as a method, as a tool to inform people of where the previous scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel in the 7th century, had been corrupted. Now that's key, because when you understand it, when you actually understand what they really want you to believe, you can actually start to realize how silly this is, how obviously incorrect this is, and you've realized that they have nothing left and it's basically game over. Or at least I think it is. I mean, maybe some amazing super-headed, even more heavyweight Muslim than Libiano can come along and come up with some other weird and bizarre theory. But this is the best. So why is this nonsense? What they want you to think as a Muslim, the Quran author is intentionally making contradictions. That's the first thing. And you need to mention this as well to Muslims, so they understand what they need to believe first to get this off the ground. They want Muslims to believe the Quran is making contradictions intentionally within its own paradigm. So the first part of this contradiction is to affirm the Torah and Gospel, and then to never specify what particularly it's affirming and denying, right? So it never says, but there is a confirmation, but he's going to insist it's a specific confirmation of only parts, some parts, but other parts. Okay, fine. Then you need to think, okay, so what the Quran author is doing now is, first of all, the Quran author is God. This is circular. He assumes that the author is God in order for this argument to work, because otherwise you would have to explain how the author could be all-knowing, to know all these different things, to know what the original revelation was, and to have the power to actually correct it. So it assumes that Allah is the author. So it's a circular argument. But okay, fine. That's another problem. But the bigger problem, the real heart of this, is first that you have to believe the Quran author is choosing to use contradictions to reveal a greater truth. And the greater truth is that the previous scriptures have been corrupted in some parts, but not others. and that you can infer what the correct original revelation was in the Torah and Gospel, for example, by looking at where the Quran intentionally contradicts these texts. This is wrong for a good few many reasons. The first is this, and Libyan actually says this later on in the video, but he says, if you can show where the author, which again they assume here is the all-knowing, all-omnipotent Allah, God, is choosing to re-reveal the original, again in the Quran, that if he can potentially be doing that in one place, that's sufficient to squash the Islamic dilemma. Because if Allah can be consciously editing or re-revealing the original in the Quran, then we can just apply this to every contradiction. All the contradictions are therefore solved, meaning we've got a way of reconciling what it means to confirm. That's what he's getting at. This doesn't follow, because even if you were to grant this, which I suggest you don't because it's ridiculous, but if you did, it would only cover a few of the contradictions at best. For all the other contradictions that remain, you would still have the Islamic dilemma. All you've done is you've just sort of ad hoc introduced this idea that actually maybe we should just hard assume the author is God and then just let that possibly help us for a few things, but not for all the other contradictions. So let's see Libiano's example, because he's going to give us one of the best examples ever. So let's see what he has to say.
Or when the author is engaging with the text polemically, where the author seems to, well, we know the author is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but, looking at it from the outside, where the author seems to be engaging polemically with these biblical traditions. So there is awareness of these biblical traditions that can't be denied. I mean, not even academics deny that. The Quran knows what the text says.
Did you notice what he said there? He said the Quran author knows what the text says. That is a huge assumption, and that's not consensus, like scholarly consensus. There's no basis for Libiano saying that from a point of reason. He has to say that because he needs to desperately establish the author's God. So if the author doesn't know what's in these texts, it's game over for Islam because the author's not all-knowing, right? That's where you get to if you go down that route. So the author has to know everything that's in this text. He conflates the text with the oral tradition because ultimately the Islamic dilemma really gets to is that Muhammad and whoever the Quran author is, like whoever's reciting it, they knew a lot about oral traditions. They knew about the story of Moses, of Abraham. They knew about Isa, or Jesus as we call him. They know these things. But at the same time, they don't know them well enough not to make errors when telling the stories. Or they know them well enough, but they don't actually care to portray them faithfully because they actually just want to take these stories, use them for polemical purposes by altering their contents for their own gain. Which would mean that the author is not actually confirming these stories. He's intentionally manipulating them for his own purposes, his own desires. But notice that this is all just oral tradition. This is just things that he hears, which of course scholars have said for a long time. The Quran author clearly knows a lot about these oral traditions that come from, ultimately, the Torah and Gospel. But whether he knows the text is a totally different question. Sidney Griffith, in his book The Bible in Arabic, points out that the general consensus is that there was not a translated Bible in Arabic in the 7th century, that only came later. And of course the manuscript evidence points to this, and even the Arabic language points to this, because the Arabic language in a written form hadn't been fully developed yet, and wouldn't be for perhaps another 100 years or so. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was illiterate. He did not even know how to read, even if he could have read a copy of an Arabic Torah or Gospel. He would have had to have read, if he was literate, which according to their tradition he wasn't, he would have had to have read a Aramaic, Greek, or Hebrew form of the Torah and Gospel, which is what Christians at the time would have been using if they even had written records, which is probably quite rare given that this is as scholars would say, a non-literate region of Arabia at the time. So all the evidence goes against him, but he has to assert this because otherwise, well, he knows how that would look.
I think the best example is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is retelling the story of Moses, and the story parallels the story in Exodus almost identically. So he tells him, Moses, pick up the staff. He picks it up. Moses, throw the staff. He throws it. It turns into a snake. He tells him, Moses, pick it back up. It turns back into a staff. And he tells him, Moses, put your hand under your cloak. Moses does that. So up until here, the Quran and the Exodus account are almost identical. And then Moses takes out his hand, but in the Quran, it says, تَخْرُجُ بَيْضَاءً مِنْ غَيْرِ سُوءٍ آيَةً أُخْرَى. that his hand comes out white but not leprous, without leprosy, without any defect. The Torah says that his hand came out white and leprous. It had a defect. So it's not that the Quran is saying, well, his hand came out white and completely ignores or doesn't mention the leprosy. It's that the Quran says it is not defected, it is not leprous, which means that there must have been a claim out there that says it's leprous. Well, we know where that comes from. It comes from Exodus. That's the most parsimonious explanation. Exodus says that his hand was leprous. The Quran knows that, and the Quran disagrees, right?
So Libiano gives the story of, in Exodus, Moses is given signs to show to Pharaoh, and one of them is he puts his hand in his cloak, takes it out, it becomes leprous. Puts his hand in, takes it out again, it's not leprous. Now he's going to make this into an interesting contradiction that I actually don't think is a contradiction. I think you can harmonize the Quranic account and this pretty easily. But ultimately, whether it's a contradiction or not is fine from my perspective. I think it helps either way for the Islamic dilemma. But notice what he's doing here. He's insisting that the way we have to look at this is, if it is a contradiction, which he's saying it is, we must look at it in light of the fact that the Quran author knows about the text. So again, he has to be all-knowing because he needs to know exactly what's in the text. He also needs to know what the original said. Again, has to be all-knowing. Only God at this point could know what the original said, since the original has long since been corrupted in their paradigm. And therefore, whenever the author contradicts the very account he's supposedly confirming, it's because he's doing it intentionally. But that assumes who the author is, and it assumes what the motives of the author are. And this also fails at the very basic level. We can look at Occam's razor, for example, the principle that we don't multiply conditions beyond necessity. We don't need to introduce all these other aspects. For example, what Libiano is asking you to believe is that, one, the author of the Quran is God. He's all-knowing, and he has a desire to confirm a corrupted scripture, not explicitly state it's corrupted. Then he uses internal contradictions as a way of implicitly showing you which parts are corrupted and which parts aren't, without ever mentioning this by name. Or the alternative that I'm positing here, it's a human author and he's made a mistake. That's what we're comparing here. One of these is very simple and does not require a lot of conditions. The other one is immensely complex and requires a lot of conditions. You have to assume who the author is, that they're all-knowing, that they have a very specific plan in mind, that they're silent about this plan, that they intend to reveal it implicitly, and that this has basically gone unnoticed for 1400 years. That's what he's asking you to believe. Now, regarding his example, there are tons of better ones that he can give. I don't know why Muslims keep insisting on giving weird examples that aren't actually that great for demonstrating contradictions in the first place, but he insists on this one. I actually think, based on the fact the Quran author evidently assumes prior knowledge, he never fully gives stories in detail, because what's the point? If your audience is already Jews or Christians, for example, why do you need to tell them about the signs of Moses in complete detail? They already know the stories, so you can just summarize them. And I think that's what he's doing here. So when the Quran says he takes his hand out and it's without blemish, yes, because that's what Moses did. He took his hand out and it was without blemish. It says so in the Exodus account, Exodus chapter 4. So I just think the Quran is just missing the first part of it, because everyone knows what that is, right? If I tell you, you take your hand out and it's without blemish, I'm implying that, one, there was a blemish, and that the purpose of the sign is that it heals your hand. And that's all the Quran's doing. It's just summarizing the story. Yes, one of his signs was that his hand was healed. That's literally it. But they insist on seeing it as a contradiction, because I don't know. But I don't actually think it is. And keep in mind as well, this is just a weak form of contradiction, and this is why we should be careful when we talk about contradictions, because it's not enough to simply say, this source says something explicitly and this source misses it, it doesn't say anything, because all that's doing is saying, well, one source says something, it says, my name is Chris, the other source says silence. Well, remember, that's not explicitly a contradiction. It's just that one source says something and another source doesn't. So if one source says Moses put his hand in, took it out, and it was white and leprous, and the other source does not mention that part, that's not actually a contradiction. It's just that one chooses to omit certain parts of a story, which, yeah, it's not a contradiction.
Another example would be the systematic editing of the major sins that the prophets commit. I mean, nobody can deny that the Quran systematically has a view of a level of infallibility when it comes to the messengers. That is, they don't commit major sins.
And now he's going to talk about the major sins and how the Quran totally re-reveals the original about all of the supposed sins that the prophets did according to the Torah. But there's one problem. It doesn't. In fact, this is, again, the same problem he had with the other example he used. The Quran is silent here. In fact, actually, the Quran introduces new problems. Abraham lies and deceives pagans into thinking that a big statue with a club smashed some little statues. Muhammad in Surah 48 ayah 2 seems pretty clear he committed sins. Moses still actually kills someone. That agrees with the Exodus account. There are a ton more examples you could go into where the Quran does portray the prophets as having sinned. So again, the fact that Muslims come to this example is just hilariously dumb because it's actually against them. They, as Sunni Muslims, in this case with Libiano here, he believes in the doctrine of Isma, that is the protection of the prophets from sins, so their infallibility. They can't go out and do terrible things. Yet his own Quran doesn't agree with him here. He's just taking a later developed doctrine and just trying to read it into the text. What's worse is, like the story of Moses, the Quran could just be omitting details because it knows the reader already knows them. The Quran doesn't need to wax lyrical about the prophet Lot sleeping with his daughters. It doesn't need to wax lyrical about Noah being drunk and naked. It doesn't need to wax lyrical about Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law. It doesn't need to because the audience already knows these stories. And so the emphasis here then would be, if the Quran was re-revealing the original and all this stuff, all these immoral things that are pertaining to the prophets are false and corruptions, despite the fact he would never explain how the Jews decided to corrupt their own prophets and defame them for, fun, I guess, according to him. He can't explain why the Quran doesn't correct them. It never says, oh, and by the way, Prophet Lot did not sleep with his daughters. Noah was not drunk. Noah was not seen naked by his sons. Like, if the Quran said that, I think he'd have at least some leg to stand on, ignoring all the other problems and other sins the Quran apparently ascribes to prophets. But because the Quran never says that, the Quran never actually disagrees with the biblical text. But he has to say it as a Sunni Muslim because he has these innovative doctrines that came centuries later that he needs to hold to, otherwise he's not a faithful Athari Salafi Muslim, he's some sort of deviant. Not saying he isn't anyway, but his Muslim friends would say it for a different reason. Keep in mind, if we applied Libiano's standard consistently here, he says, look, the Quran is parallel with these biblical traditions in the Torah. Talks about David, talks about Solomon, talks about Moses, all these characters, and then it chooses not to mention the sin. Therefore, that's the Quran re-revealing the original, which is that there was no sin. In the original account, no sin was ever mentioned, so the Quran doesn't mention it because that's the original. Except there's a problem here. If you were consistent with this methodology, you would have to say, well then, we can't say Jesus was born in Bethlehem, that he was a Galilean, that he had a ministry, that the disciples of him had names and had jobs and actual backgrounds and character. All this stuff is stuff that you find in the biblical account that the Quran takes for granted and that Muslims, again, today believe in. But if the criteria is just that if the Quran doesn't mention it, it means it was never there in the original, then that's like most of the gospel just removed. The gospel was next to nothing, had basically very little content in it if we go with that line of reasoning. So evidently that's false. Now for actual arguments as to why re-revealing just isn't possible in large swathes of the Quran. The reason why is because in order for the argument to be made that the Quran is re-revealing the original, what the Quran contains has to be a criteria for the original. What I mean by that is it has to be using terms appropriate given the context of Moses, for the Torah, for example. So if the Quran uses contemporary language and contemporary stories, homilies, liturgies that is engaging with, instead of things that would only pertain to a Hebrew people at the time of Moses, for example, 1200 BC, whatever date we want to give, if the Quran isn't trying to re-reveal a original detail that would have been in the account given to Moses and the Torah, and instead it's engaging with contemporaries, it's engaging with Syriac resources from Christians, for example, that are homilaic, they're part of the liturgy, that would be simplified for the layman, to give simplified stories of prophets, and the Quran chooses to engage with that. That can't be a criteria for the original, because to give you a sort of understanding and break this down, If Allah was trying to re-reveal in the Quran the original, but he keeps instead using stories as they were understood in the 7th century context in Arabia by Aramaic-speaking Christians who come from a Syriac background, who have Jacob of Saru, Afrahat, and other ascetics or bishops and their particular context, then it can't also be in the context of Moses in 12th, 13th century BC. It can only be one or the other, right? Because otherwise it would be a mix, and that would mean if it's a mix, then it has some parts that are re-revealed, but some parts that are not. So again, that would still mean there are some things that aren't being re-revealed and hence are just still contradictory. This is what we find in the evidence. You can look, and my book goes into detail on this, you can look at Joseph Witztum and Charbel Risk. These are two scholars who have evaluated the different prophetic stories, and they've come to the conclusion that yes, the Quran actually does engage with these, and it is influenced by them in a way that we can detect in the actual Quranic text. The Quran author is choosing to engage with retellings of the story of Joseph, for example, in Surah 12, according to Syriac Christian homilies, not according to the potential original revelation given to Moses. We could point at many examples of this. For these scholars and their work, I'll put a link down below. You guys can check it out. If I forget, please nag me in the comments until I actually do it. They give tons of examples as to how we can know this, and they're very convincing. Gabriel Said Reynolds actually includes them in his work on his latest book, so you can check that out there if you would like to. But you can boil this down just to some very quick examples, but one would be Surah 12, ayah 20. So in this verse, it clearly says that Moses was purchased for dirham, which is the Arabic transliteration of a Greek coin that originated in the 6th century BC. Now, Muslims are immediately going to chirp up with this and be like, no, you know, it's just like talking using contemporary language that was appropriate to the time. This word had taken on bigger meaning to be a more generic term that just meant like a currency or a unit of weight. Absolutely fine. I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have, though, is that if that's the case, then it can't be a candidate for the original revelation given to Moses, because that's clearly a development. That word, dirham, and the way it's being used is a development in the language to convey a different meaning that would make sense to people in Muhammad's time who knew about this Greek coin, but would not make sense at the time of Moses when that coin didn't even exist. And so for that reason, in this instance, you can't say that using that term is an attempt by the author to re-reveal the original given to Moses. It's not possible. Now, if I can show in one place, and we can just all over the place, that the Quran is not trying to re-reveal any original, it's perfectly happy just using what was around at the time and even making his own changes to it to prove his own points, then it seems like, again, the Quran says it's confirming something, but it actually doesn't, because it doesn't even know what it is that it is confirming. Or worse, yeah, it says the Quran author says he's confirming something, but then chooses to contradict it at a later point because it's just pragmatic to do so. It serves a polemic purpose. He wants to relate stories to Muhammad, and if he has to change those stories a little bit to make them sound a bit more like Muhammad's context, you know, make it a bit more relatable to how you guys are seeing Muhammad, then he does that, which again means he's just modifying the stories and he's not actually confirming them. He's just saying he is when he knows all along he's not. So either way, there's no easy way out of this, and yeah, conscious edits are just crap, really. There's no one takes this seriously. Conscious edits was again originated in Dean Respond's bedroom at 1 a.m. in the morning when he couldn't sleep because the Islamic dilemma keeps him awake at night. It has, in fact, actually, the irony is, as far as I know, the idea that the Quran could be doing this and that it employs intentional contradictions in its own text to give you this sort of secret code that it's meant to be re-revealing something, I don't think that's found in scholarship, to be perfectly honest with you. And keep in mind, there's a difference here between the Quran just has the correct account, because that's one view, but their view is not that. Their view, they tie everything together to try to give an explanation as to why the Quran author is doing this, why there are contradictions, and that's that it's intentionally contradicting to show you that this is the original re-revealing of what Moses was originally given or what Isa was originally given. So those are two views, and that later view, I don't think that's found anywhere. I think that, yeah, like I said, it existed in Dean's mind somewhere. Now watch this bit where Libiano is asked by Cora the Takia. Sorry, not Takia, Taimi. I got confused because of the whole, you know, thing. Anyway, she asks Orthodox Muslim a great question about how how Muslims can avoid falling into pit traps when presenting the Islamic dilemma. And Libiano graciously gives his very big opinion on how some less educated Muslims, the lesser ones, sometimes make mistakes when engaging with the Islamic dilemma. So let's see what he says.
All right. So obviously, amongst the apologetic scene, there are a lot of people that engage with the Islamic dilemma on a daily basis. So what do you think are the biggest mistakes that people make when they take a look at the Islamic dilemma or when they engage with it?
Yeah, so I've pointed this out a few times on my channel whenever I get the chance. When Muslims try to engage this line of argumentation, what they get caught up in, and this is both Muslims and Christians, what they get caught up in is trying to show some unambiguous passage that says I am confirming everything in the Torah, or I am disagreeing here, or it's textually corrupted. Now, there are some passages that imply textual corruption without a shadow of a doubt, like chapter 2, verse 79, other passages that could be interpreted that way. That could certainly imply, according to some interpretations, textual corruption. The problem is, it's not explicit enough. And it's not meant to be explicit enough anyway.
Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? That was a great admission. Libiano just told us, he just gave the ball away. He said, look, in the Quran, verses like 279, which is, in my opinion, the only possible verse that you could derive some kind of total universal corruption from, he says it's not explicit enough. It just isn't there in the text. Oh, thank you. Thank you. The Oscars go to Libiano. Best performance, best running, best God Logic imitator. Like all of it goes to Libiano. I thought he just revealed that. He just revealed, yeah, he gave the game away. There is no explicit mention of wholesale, total, universal corruption in the Quran. Thank you very much. I'll take that. That's an epic win for the Islamic dilemmators.
Now, later scholars seem to be unanimous in what these passages mean. Earlier scholars were not so unanimous.
No, here he gives us more points. He just concedes more and says, yeah, it seems to be that when you look at the earliest commentators, the opinion was divided about exactly what this corruption looked like. Only from the 11th century onwards, through Ibn Hazm and his contemporaries, do we start to see this idea that the Torah and Gospel have been totally lost. They aren't present in some form anymore. They've gone by the wayside. And just to drop one thing in, just because someone says and mentions Talif al-Lafs or textual corruption does not mean that they think that the entire Torah or Gospel have been lost. That's a different thing. And people often conflate this, or they try to, imply that because someone mentioned that some guy's manuscript somewhere might not be the actual Torah that he's claiming it to be, therefore there is no Torah. That's not the case. I've not seen any early Islamic scholars come up with the argument that the Torah and Gospel have just gone in the early period. You won't see that. They're obviously aware of Christians and Jews who have the Torah and the Gospel, and they're aware that their context is that Muhammad and his family even had the Gospel, for example. So, according to their tradition anyway. So, they know that. They need to wait a good few hundred years before they can make that kind of claim. And that's historically what happened. This next bit I think is really revealing. Dora asks the question to Libiano. She says, what should you do if you want to engage as a Muslim on the Islamic dilemma?
All right. So, let's say somebody is in a discourse with a Christian or just an individual who wants to discuss the Islamic dilemma. What do you think the first thing a Muslim should do when responding to this argument?
And I just want you to just watch Libiano's body language. Watch how he just look at this.
Well, so I don't think the Islamic dilemma is that serious of an argument to give it that much thought anyway. I think a Muslim needs to, before engaging in this argument, a Muslim needs to first understand what the Quran says about the Torah and the Gospel, and what the proof texts for it are, which verses, and what the historical context is. How did the early generations understand it, and so on and so forth. But if somebody wants to engage with a Christian, not just on this topic but on any topic, they need to be read up. It's not that the argument is strong. Is that if a Christian or any Kafir brought a weak argument that somebody hasn't heard of before, was not read up on, then it's obviously not going to go too well for them. So just don't speak without knowledge, and if you feel like you're not equipped, then don't even put yourself in that position. Don't even speak about these things to begin with.
Just look at what he does. He looks so defeated. He looks so... There's nothing positive in what he's saying here. He knows this is just concession. Like, and everything he's saying, he's not giving hope. He's not like, you know, the Dawa guys, you can do really good. There's so much ground you can learn on. There's so much unexplored territory. There's so much academia is yet to reveal to us. He doesn't say anything like that. He's just like, oh, well, if you got to debate the Islamic dilemma, you know, you could, I guess, just make sure you've read on the Islamic dilemma. You know what the Islamic dilemma is. It's like it just doesn't have any flair there. There's nothing there that you can latch onto to give you hope. Man, I'm glad I'm not a Muslim, because that's the most defeatist speech I've ever heard in regards to. Can you imagine if a Christian was like that? Just learn about the Trinity, but be very careful. Like, he ends the whole speech he gives by saying, "Look, just be very careful, right, guys? When you, if you don't know enough, don't talk about it. If you don't know, don't speak. Shut up. Don't engage them." Because he knows people like me, like, you know, all the apologists, we're just gonna eat you alive if you talk about this. We know, look, he knows he'll be eaten alive, which is why he doesn't debate God logic on this topic, or anyone, or me. Literally, the dude ran from me when I asked to debate him on this in person. So yeah, like, that's what they've got. They're literally scared about this, and he's telling his own brothers, don't bring this up unless you're like super exceptional. Basically, you have to be as good as Libiano. So like a solid 4 out of 10 before you can even debate the Islamic dilemma. So that's interesting. I find that really thoughtful. Thank you, Libby. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've covered kind of the highlights of this live stream that Dora the Explorer, that Cora the Taimi did with Libby, and I'm not very impressed. I think all of this is addressed in my book. It's almost as if they haven't even moved from these positions yet. Probably because there is nothing after this, right? After this, it's game over. This is the bottom of the barrel, and it's basically just relying on ignorance that Muslims aren't aware of this yet. They aren't aware that conscious edits is a laughable idea, that the Quran blatantly doesn't exhort. The Quran actually uses texts in its own ways that aren't always re-revealing, which means that the contradictions are not potentially resolved by assuming conscious edits. And it ultimately means, for those 1 million people that watched the debate with Sam and Dr. Nasser on the Islamic dilemma, there is still no answer. So, welcome to the Islamic dilemma. This is 2026, and it'll be going for years and years and years to come. If Libiano really is the best that we have, then Christians and non-Muslims are in a very good position when it comes to this argument, because that is absolutely dreadful. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to be doing more content about Quranic miracles. I've been doing a ton of research into that. Really enjoying it. It's a really fun topic to dive into, and I want to do a very comprehensive breakdown of it so that you guys can benefit, and that we can hopefully not have Muslims genuinely thinking their Quran is miraculous anymore. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. God bless. Take care.